Hello, I'm Mara Lee, a reporter at International Trade Today, a trade publication that serves trade attorneys, customs brokers, and others who follow trade policy. I'm out of Washington, and I've been covering trade since 2018. Today, we're hearing from Dr. Deborah K. Elms, head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. This is an educational program from the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA in partnership with the Heinrich Foundation, an independent Asia-based philanthropic organization dedicated to advancing beneficial and sustainable global trade. AFPC USA is solely responsible for the content of this episode. Dr. Elms, please share with us your white paper on Section 301, the law that is expected to hike tariffs around the world.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy to be back again with the Foreign Press Association. Yes, 301 is an interesting animal. It is the reason that I wrote this paper is that it is being lined up as the successor to US tariff policy. Those people who are in supply chains logistics or trade watchers will be quite keenly aware that the United States, when Donald Trump came back into office, tried to use a statute called the Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose tariffs against everyone, most famously out in the Rose Garden on April 2nd when he held up those big poster boards and sort of tariffed everybody on the planet, and then negotiated those tariffs down. IEEPA was in place against the globe until the Supreme Court overturned it in February. We now have a sort of temporary holding statute, if you will, that is applying 10% tariffs through July. And there is an expectation that the United States will move to more durable tariff authorities, potentially any day now, but presumably before the temporary authority expires in July, called Section 301. So I wrote this particular paper because I'm not sure that people are aware of the power of Section 301. So when IEEPA was struck down, I heard repeatedly from people not to worry, that Trump's tariff authority was now gone. He could no longer threaten tariffs on Monday and impose them on Tuesday, that he would be restrained in his activities, that there was going to be a lot more sort of less tariffs and more common sense going forward. And having studied 301, and in particular, part of my PhD dissertation was actually on Section 301, I thought this is very dangerous. People are not aware of this particular tool, and I should write a paper to explain it. So then let me, with that long context, just give you a sense of what's in 301. So Section 301 was started in the 70s and the 1980s in the United States at a time when we did not have the institutional structure in place, or the same institutional structure in place that we achieved in 1995 with the creation of the World Trade Organization. And in particular, what we were missing from the US perspective was we were missing a good enforcement capability. So if there were rules in place and a government violated those rules, there was no way to hold them accountable under the previous system in the 70s and the 80s and into the early 90s. So US Congress created a rule called Section 301. It's Section 301 of the tariff policy. And under Section 301, the United States could act as judge, jury, and executioner. And it was therefore able to hold other countries accountable to whatever rules the United States thought were important. During the 70s, the rule was used, but it really accelerated in the 1980s. The primary target at the time was Japan for what the United States saw as unfair trade practices of all different kinds. There were trade actions taken under Section 301 against a variety of countries, not just Japan, although they were perhaps the most famous target. And the argument under Section 301 at the time was, we identify some kind of unfair trade practices from the US perspective. You then have negotiations with that trading partner to try to resolve the issue. The issue is meant to be resolved before the statute of limitations basically runs out. And then you've solved the problem that you were trying to solve. If, however, the trade partner was not interested in resolving the issue or did not resolve it to the satisfaction of the United States, then the United States reserved the right to impose sanctions, basically sanctions against that trading partner, to compel them to do whatever it is the United States wanted to do. In practice, through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, very few cases went all the way to the end. And of the cases that went all the way to the end, almost none of them actually had the sanctions imposed. So typically, sanctions would come into effect at midnight, and at 11:59 p.m., there would be an announcement that they had resolved this issue. And so we actually saw very, very few examples of this whole statute being used, relatively few. I think, I don't remember what the total case numbers were, but so let's call it 150. And of those, almost none actually went to the sanctions territory. Okay, then 1995 comes, the birth of the World Trade Organization. The United States says, we don't need to do this anymore because now we've got an institution that actually has real teeth. We can unilaterally disarm. We will not use Section 301 again. And in practice, the United States basically did not use the Section 301 until the until the first Trump administration, when we had, especially crucially, Robert Lighthizer, who was serving as the US Trade Representative at the time, who had helped draft the original Section 301 legislation, who knew it inside out, backwards and forwards, who said that there are some unfair trade practices taking place in the first Trump administration. It was mostly about China. We will reuse this tool. There's no other way for us to get at these unfair trade practices. We will use this tool against largely China at the time. That was extended in the Biden administration. And when the Trump administration came back into power, there was discussion about using Section 301, but it is not until right now that they have launched new Section 301 cases. There are two cases that are currently outstanding against 60 US trading partners for two different purposes. So there is one case that's currently open on forced labor. The argument is that you're either practicing forced labor or that you are insufficiently paying attention to forced labor in a supply chain. Therefore, if you are found guilty, we have the right, would say the US, to retaliate against you in this case. And in the other, against a smaller subset of those same countries, for what the US calls structural excess capacity, you are unfairly producing too much of something, you are dumping it on the market, and you are harming the United States as a result. Those are currently under investigation, and we expect the announcement about those cases to come out at any time. Unlike the original use of Section 301 in the 70s and 80s, when the Trump team came back in the first term and certainly in the second term, the rule was subverted. Instead of having a sort of assumption of guilt, and then we investigate, and then we negotiate, and then if we have to, we impose sanctions, the Trump administration flipped it on its head and said, you are guilty after the investigation, guilty. We impose sanctions, and then potentially we can negotiate our way out of that. But we, instead of waiting to the end to impose, we started with the sanctions. And the assumption, again, is that this administration, this time around, will do the same thing. So up to 60 US trading partners will receive some kind of punishment for unfair trade practices under one or the other of these two cases. Because the Trump administration likes tariffs, it's likely that the punishment will be tariffs. But I would just note that Section 301 doesn't require tariffs. You could do lots of things, whatever the United States wanted to do as an unfair. Again, remember, you're unilateral judge, jury, and executioner. You can do a lot of different things. And so the reason why I wrote this paper, and again, I apologize for the long length of this, but this is complicated, is that I don't think people can understand how powerful this particular tool is and what license it will give to the US administration now and potentially into the future. Because this, once you've done all of the steps to show that this is an unfair trade partner, frankly, the sky is the limit on what kinds of retaliatory actions the United States might seem fit to impose. And that, I think, is something that companies and governments need to be aware of before they are in the middle of this Section 301 frenzy, which is, I think, just getting started.
Um, Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I agree. You put in the paper that the Trump administration was unchastened by the loss of the Supreme Court. I think that's absolutely accurate. I do want to add one bit of nuance, which is the Nicaragua 301 case, which
Hmm.
was concluded in the Biden administration, but the punishment was determined in the Trump administration, was moderated by stakeholder input. They did not put tariffs on Nicaraguan goods for the human rights violations they found, particularly because of domestic interests in the garment industry. There's a integrated supply chain between Central America and U.S. yarn producers and cotton growers. And USTR Greer has said this time that once he releases the conclusions, he will open up another round of input for stakeholders before deciding what tariffs, if any, are coming. So it may be moderated somewhat by US commercial interests, but only somewhat, because Trump is very suspicious of corporations, seeing them as just wanting to outsource and save money and screw over the American worker. So his willingness to listen will be somewhat limited by his own biases and longtime views of trade. All right, so my first question. You said that Congress created the 301 process because US exports were seen as critical drivers of growth. Exports have been growing quickly at the time that the bill was passed, but they seesawed in the 1970s and 80s. They were at about 8% of GDP in 75, fell in 77, up to 10% in 1980, then fell again to about 7% in the mid 80s. Was Congress wrong to focus on non-tariff barriers to goods exports as a barrier to U.S. prosperity?
So you have to, our younger viewers may not be aware of all of this history, but if you were around in the 70s, there was a real concern about the competitiveness of many markets, first of all, and that these competitive foreign markets were creating inroads into the US market. So their exports were actually starting to, sounds very familiar today, but flooding the United States with excess capacity, causing the US economy to slow potentially, and also manufacturing in particular to diminish, especially its own competitiveness. And that one of the ways to solve this at the time, as you mentioned, is to increase US exports. So if you're having trouble in your own home market, then you need to have even more access to foreign markets to help compensate, to keep the machinery running domestically in the US. And exports at the time were extremely important on a bipartisan basis, I would argue. Both sides saw that exports were a good thing to have. That has been undermined a bit. That enthusiasm for exports, I think, has been undermined a bit. And in particular, although Trump occasionally will talk about the importance of exports, he predominantly is interested in imports rather than exports. And so I think Congress at the time had a sense that, again, how do we get economic growth in the US? We need to ensure that export markets are kept open. There was a concern at the time that the reason why the US was struggling to export, if it was not because the US was not competitive. It was because the foreign markets were unfair. They were closed to US exports. They were often closed to US exports, though, in not so obvious ways. So the reason why we call them the non-tariff barriers is because it wasn't a tariff that was in place that kept exports from being successful. It was all kinds of other kinds of obstacles. It could have been, as an example, rules about how ships could be unloaded, who could unload the containers off of a ship or the content off of a ship. And if you said that only these kinds of people or these kinds of, union workers, for example, could do that, then those people might only work, let's imagine, 4 hours a day, right? So now, if you're a US export on a ship, you only have 4 hours a day in which to get the goods off the ship and into the marketplace. And that was seen as an unfair trade barrier because they could potentially remove domestic products or products that were, not American off the ship 24/7, but they limited the time for US unloading, as an example. So that would be a non-tariff barrier that the United States said this is totally unfair and discriminatory. And because the rules at the time didn't allow a legal case, equivalent of a legal case. I know I'm going to get complaints from lawyers, but I will call it a legal case. To succeed at the time under the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, they said, we have to do this on our own. We have to pry these markets open. Prying these markets open requires us to call out this activity, this behavior, and then to do something to make that happen differently. So we have to be very specific. At the time, it was be much more specific about what is the unfair trade practice, what is it we would like to have done about it, and how can we negotiate our way to solving that. Again, this is a bit different now, where the case is much wider and the evidence is much more flexible, I would say, right? It's not just sort of, every 4 hours we have a shift change. It's much more sort of amorphous kinds of complaints, especially, for example, if I look at the structural excess capacity case that the United States filed, it said that in some instances there was too many exports, and in some cases there was not enough exports. So a little hard to understand how both of those things, which are the polar opposite of one another, can be true and both be a problem. Nonetheless, that's the kind of cases that we've got open now. And so that is the question that we have, is sort of how do you deal with originally exports, which I think were a concern, and non-tariff barriers remain a concern for US companies, and in fact for companies everywhere. They're always worried about other ways that you can block foreign products from the market. This administration is perhaps less worried about exports and far more worried about imports. And so that's really where we're at now. We flip this around. It's more about unfair trade practices that are leading to too much competitiveness in the United States, and a lack of the US would argue, a lack of paying attention to the consequences of foreign behavior on the US economy.
Well, again, this isn't the first time this kind of anxiety has been front and center in US trade policy. In addition to looking at how much exports made up GDP, there was also attention paid to the ratio of imports to exports. It reached a record in 1986 that made people believe that US manufacturing was not competitive with other countries' production. And Robert Lighthizer was a deputy in the USTR at the time, and he helped work on voluntary export restraints and on promises of Japanese automakers to open plants in the United States. Trump has also talked about investment in the United States as part of these deals. How much do you think domestic investment and voluntary export restraints will be part of this negotiation this time, in addition to tariffs?
That is a great question. I would say so. Donald Trump himself, actually, in exactly the same time period in the 80s, took out his first full page ad complaining about Japan and the unfair trade practices of Japan against the United States. And so, if you want to sort of look back over his career, this is the moment when Donald Trump became very obsessed with trade and argued that you should have restrictions on imports as a way to help deal with that. And in Trump's mind, and this is the connection, in Trump's mind, the primary tool for whatever ails you is a tariff. He has said repeatedly, it's the most beautiful word in the English language. He genuinely means it. When he thinks about how to fix whatever ails you, it's a tariff. So if it were up to Trump, I'm not convinced that we would see voluntary export restraints or any kind of export rules, that we would see other kinds of innovative uses of trade tools. Because Trump is all about tariffs. But the people who are around him, many of them think that tariffs are perhaps not the ideal way to solve all problems, that there is a limit to the amount of tariffs that you can impose in terms of like the height of the tariffs. The application of tariffs to everybody creates problems. And so there should be more selective use of different kinds of implements or instruments that would get at some of these trade issues. Some of those people are likely to say, why don't we, if we have a problem with imports, restrain exports from the foreign partner into the United States? Rather than just put up a wall to stop them, they could also restrain themselves. I think there is a discussion, I'm sure, in Washington about whether that would be a sensible approach. I think one big difference between the 80s and now is that in the 1980s, it was the Japanese who were prepared to do this. And they were prepared to do voluntary export restraints for a variety of reasons. I am not convinced that the trade partners of the United States today would be as enthusiastic about restraining their own exports to the United States. Now, where they clearly have shown more interest is they have shown more enthusiasm for the alternative to that, which is also more inbound investment or alternatively buying more US stuff, right? So there's a couple of different ways you can get at this. I don't think we're going to see a lot of voluntary export restraints. There's a lot of literature that shows that that was a disaster for the US, that basically what happened is Japanese companies, instead of sending cheap cars to the United States, said, fine, if I can only sell 100 cars, then I'm not going to sell 100 cheap cars. I'm going to sell 100 very expensive cars. And in fact, they decimated the top end of the US market with very expensive Japanese cars, which were extremely successful until quite recently. So that didn't appear to work. So I don't think that that's necessarily a tool that's back on the agenda. But the investment, maybe, from some players, and there's an open question about the extent to which the Trump administration is enthusiastic about Chinese investment in the United States, but they are enthusiastic about other people's investment, whether that's Japanese or Australian or whoever else, somebody else, you invest in the United States. That seems to be attractive, as is buying stuff. So, even Cambodia agreed to buy 10 Boeing aircraft from the United States as part of their plan to get out from underneath these very high reciprocal tariffs. So I think there are some folks who are arguing for more creative use of tools and levers to try to ensure that the US economy continues to grow and that the damage to the US economy that is perceived to come from foreign imports is limited.
Your white paper mentioned two launched in 301 investigations that have not released recommendations, one against Brazil. Also mentioned six potential investigations that Greer wrote about, seafood, rice, etc. Does it really matter how many irritants have been named as 301 topics if, as we've heard the cabinet members say, the tariffs that they're aiming to impose are more or less identical to what was in place under the reciprocal tariffs?
That is a great question. I think the answer is no for two reasons, really. So the first is that, again, 301 is a very powerful tool. Once I have found that you are guilty of unfair trade practices, I can basically adjust those rules to find that you are still guilty of unfair trade practices. If I found you guilty under forced labor before, I could adjust it to say, well, also there's this business around fisheries or rice or digital or fill in the blank what. So once I found you guilty, you're guilty of whatever it is that I decide to find you guilty of. And so you're right, you don't need to have a lot of other cases. I think the reason why those were potentially flagged and may still go forward is that you could name different countries for different purposes, right? So you could say that on rice, we go after these countries, which are very hard to get on these other areas, maybe. Or you have the potential to add up the tariff, assuming again that tariffs is the primary tool the US will use. You could say, well, for forced labor, let's imagine it's a 6% tariff. And for excess capacity, it's a 9% tariff. And then we could top that up if we needed to. Here's 4% for rice or fill in the blank what, right? So I can imagine that you could say, well, if I had more 301s, then I'm just adding up the consequences. And in the end, you are, surprise, surprise, right back where you started on reciprocal tariff liberation day in April of last year, or later in the year when the rates were lowered as a result of market reaction. So I think that it probably doesn't matter how many 301 cases you name, as long as once you've got 60 of your largest trading partners. I'm not sure that it makes sense to say that Vanuatu is now guilty of something. Maybe, or whatever, some country for which the United States doesn't actually trade very much with. So maybe this is a way for you to go after other partners in the future, or to keep as a negotiating tool. So I'm less fussed about some of the topics that Greer has raised, but I would say things like digital trade as a Section 301 is a very interesting, very large sort of category of things. And the response to that might not just be tariffs. So I can imagine we found you guilty. These are the tariffs that you've applied for whatever purposes. But here on the digital 301, we're also going to apply rules around licensing or tax policy or like lots of other things. And so maybe that's a better way for them to try to split out tariff consequences from other kinds of consequences.
Going back to the reciprocal rates from August and the agreed to reciprocal trade agreements, many countries in Asia agreed to double-digit tariffs with the understanding that they would still be at parity with their near competitors and at an advantage compared to Chinese rates. Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, all of them seem to be coming together in the high teens. However, China recently said it will only accept tariffs of 20% or less once the 301s are done. Now, they do have the previous 301 rates of 25% and 7.5% on about two-thirds of their exports. But for many goods, if China is at 20 and Malaysia is at 19, Malaysia is at a cost disadvantage. Will those countries that had previously accepted high teens, thinking that they were going to be at a cost advantage with China, still accept it if China is at 20%? And if they don't accept it, do they have any leverage to get the US to back down?
Well, I think there's a lot that's sort of packed into this question. And part of it is the Chinese have announced a 20% ceiling. So the Chinese have said that's it. The Americans have not said that it's 20. So the Americans could reserve the right, I'm imagining, to make that baseline level higher. And in particular, I can imagine the United States saying 34, which is the US level at the time of this negotiation with the Chinese. So if the Chinese ceiling is 34, then there's a little more, wiggle room for everybody else to be still high, but less than China. So I suspect that the US first idea will be to push the Chinese number up rather than push everyone else down. But we'll have to sort of see how that goes. There is going to be some real challenges here for the United States because you're either going to upset, well, you're probably going to upset everybody, but you could upset the Chinese who are going to be upset anyway. So is it 20% upsetness bigger or worse than 34% upsetness? I don't know. But you also have to, as you just mentioned, keep the tariff differentials in place. And so what you don't want is China to have lower tariffs than everybody else. That would be a problem for the US, I think. But it would also be a problem for other trade actors who are going to look at this and say, well, that's really unfair. So the US is in a bit of a bind in my mind because it's trying to do things that are incompatible, which is to try to deal with the Chinese perceived threat from the Chinese economy, plus deal with everybody else and keep some kind of relationship in place. That's going to be that's going to be a difficult circle to square here, I think, because no matter how you slice this, I think you're going to end up with some upset trade partners. And many of them are upset not just because of the tariffs, but of course they're also upset because they're accused of forced labor or they're accused of excess capacity or under capacity or whatever, or just flat out accused of being unfair. And I think for a lot of countries that trade with the United States, that is in and of itself going to be an issue. And then of course you have the additional economic damage caused by raising prices on your exports or on your imports into the United States.
As you noted, 301 tariffs can be extended indefinitely without congressional approval. Democrats have criticized Trump tariffs on allies and say that the tariffs are inflationary. Do you think that if the Democrats win a majority in the House and win back the White House the next election, that they would work with Senate Republicans who also are not fans of tariffs, and that these politicians would work together to reform 301 to make it more difficult for the executive to wield it without congressional assent?
That's an excellent question. I would like to think so, but when I look through the U.S. legislative history where there are, we still have, as an example, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, the act that gave rise to Smoot-Hawley tariffs, Great Depression, and all the sort of disaster that came after that, still in the books in the U.S. So you might have said, well, actually, we really should get rid of that particular provision because look at how wonderfully that turned out for everybody. Let's revise that. Didn't happen. Same thing, IEEPA didn't happen. Same thing with this current temporary balance of payments, Section 122 that we have, where the United States doesn't have a balance of payments problem, nor can it have a balance of payments problem under its current floating exchange rates. Those are still in the books. So yes, of course, a subsequent administration could and probably should revise many of these trade tools, but I am not optimistic that at the end of the day, they will actually do so because Congress seems to float with inertia. And to go back and revise, sort of clean out the toolbox, if you will, and say these really are not fit for purpose anymore. Let's eliminate them or let's revise them is not something that Congress does. So I'm not optimistic for historical reasons, but I'm also not optimistic because I'm not sure that whatever subsequent Congress we have is going to have any more spine than the current Congress. And if you think about it in another context, the U.S. Congress passed laws on conflict under the War Powers Act to say the president may not continue at war, and yet we've never actually used the War Powers Act. So that is a very clear, I would argue, very clear delegation by Congress for a certain set period of time, and then Congress must act. And even though the president, whatever president we've had, has changed the rules around that, Congress still allows it to continue. So I just think if even war doesn't make you go back and adjust a rule, then I'm not positive that you're going to do so for trade purposes either. Even though I would argue if we've learned nothing from all of this, it's that the toolbox needs to be reviewed. And some of the out-of-date rules really do need to be revised or thrown out.
Well, I agree completely that inertia is the natural state of Congress, but I will defend our polity by saying they did revise Trading with the Enemy Act to get to IEEPA, and it did seem like they were doing that somewhat to try and cabin the president's authority. And I will say it's also a little bit the fault of a past Supreme Court because they said you could not have a legislative veto, and that makes it
Mm.
much harder to use things like the War Powers Act because you have to have a veto-proof majority in Congress to stop the action, whereas at one point a simple majority would have been enough, and we have had simple majorities with the War Powers Act recently. Okay, last question before we turn it to the audience questions. Um, you're not so hopeful that 301 could be revised to say these tariffs can only go in for a certain time without congressional approval. But of course, a future presidential administration, a future president could terminate 301 tariffs on his or her own. Do you think a Democratic president, if one is elected next time, might terminate them on partners where we have FTAs like Korea or on major allies like Europe and Japan?
I think it is likely that a future president of either party might actually adjust these tariffs in the future because they are currently creating challenges and they will continue to create challenges for US companies, US consumers, et cetera. So I can imagine adjustment in tariff policy going forward. The trick, though, I think, is that tariffs generate revenue and the revenue goes right straight into the Treasury. It is very difficult for a administration and a Congress to say that we no longer support the collection of these tariffs and that revenue into our budget. We see that right now under IEEPA. Once the Supreme Court overturned IEEPA, 166 billion, I think is the number, of tariffs have to be returned with interest. That is going to create some real challenges. And I think the future administrations will be wary of letting that kind of cash go out the door, even though, of course, who paid those tariffs? US companies, US citizens trying to import from abroad. So it's a tax, basically a disguised tax on US companies and US consumers. Nonetheless, once I have access to that money, I am going to be loath to let it go. Even if there are very sensible reasons, and even if it should be adjusted, that's going to be, I think, difficult, more difficult than you might imagine for an administration. And as for the inflationary effects of tariffs, it is true that tariffs are inflationary, right? When they come into force, then prices have to adjust to take those tariffs into account, especially if they're high, right? So if it's 20% or something, then it's very hard to keep prices level. Where the but that wears off quite quickly as an inflationary force, because 20%, as long as it stays 20% and it doesn't change, is a one shot inflationary adjustment of prices. But you're not going to change prices 20% every year because there's a 20% tariff in place. That's not what happens. So I think there is an immediate impact for sure, and it is not good. And there's certainly an impact in the United States because of the uncertainty of US policy and US tariff policy. That is creating real challenges for companies, real challenges for investment, et cetera. So we do see problems as a result of this, changing policy. But once you have a tariff in place, it's unlikely to make sustained inflationary pressures.
That's true, but I think we have seen that politically, at least because of how sharp inflation was during the Biden administration, a lot of voters just remember what the grocery prices used to be, and they're mad that they didn't go down. We know that disinflation is really bad for an economy, but like an average person, they don't feel better until the price actually goes back to what they remember the right price being. All right, turning to our listeners, we have a question from Mika. I hope I said that right, from Nikkei. The United States often frames Section 301 as a way to defend fairness in trade. But if other countries adopt similar unilateral tools, are we moving toward a world where trade rules are replaced by power politics?
I think we're moving that direction anyway. So far, and I think this is the bright news, largely the contagion has been contained. In other words, we had the potential, certainly heading into last year, and reciprocal tariff liberation day tariffs, for other countries to retaliate in similar ways. So we could have seen escalating tariffs across the board. We have largely not seen that. It has been the United States changing its tariffs. Everyone else, for the most part, has kept their tariffs the same, and they have not increased some kinds of trade tools that they could have used that would have created additional blockages to trade. Those restraints are starting to break down a bit, and there is a lot, I would argue, there's a bit more flexibility being shown by governments about how constrained they will be to the existing rules, global rules, regional rules, et cetera. And we are seeing some governments respond to economic pressures from one kind or another by also increasing protectionism or increasing other kinds of policies that affect market actions. So it could be subsidies, it could be changes in rules to favor domestic firms. There's a lot of different things that one could do. Largely has been restrained for the past year, but I think the longer this goes on and the more possibilities emerge about what kinds of things you could do unilaterally, the harder it will be to keep everyone from behaving in similar kinds of ways. Now, not everyone, just to be clear, not everyone has the same market power. So some countries will be less likely to impose restrictions, especially on imports, because that harms your own citizens. But there will be, I think, new adjustments being made by governments where they say this policy never worked for us. We never liked it, but we did it because we all agreed to do it. But if you're not going to agree to follow the rules, why should I keep following the rules? And that then leads to deterioration of the system, which I think is really problematic. And especially for trade exposed economies, that's going to be deeply problematic. If trade has led growth in economics, jobs, et cetera, and that now becomes more difficult, it means that domestic growth is going to be more difficult. That creates all kinds of new pressures. And we are headed into a very uncertain world, the likes of which we have not, I would argue for almost everybody on this call, they have not seen in their lifetimes. And that sort of pressure, I think, is normally felt after two world wars and a Great Depression. Let us hope we don't end up with those kinds of things. But that's where we're at. We've had a sort of rupture in the system, I think. And we are now trying to figure out where we go from here. How much of this is power politics? How much of it is still constrained by past activities, norms of behavior, laws, etc.? Unclear.
The next question is somewhat along these lines too, and I'm gonna add to it as well. Patricia from SBT asks, could the expanded use of Section 301 encourage other major economies, such as China, the European Union, or India, to develop their own versions of unilateral trade enforcement? What would that mean for global commerce? And we see the EU trying to raise barriers to Chinese imports. And USTR Greer has said that's exactly what he wants to see. What his vision is that the US puts up a wall to Chinese overcapacity, and then other developed economies also put up walls to Chinese overcapacity because what was coming here goes there and they start seeing the damage. And he thinks that that pressure combined could change China's approach. And of course, we saw China do unilateral trade enforcement with the critical minerals export controls, which is exactly how we stepped down from our peaks of tariffs, is they found the lever that would move the US off of the tariff mania. But I'll let Deborah also expound on this.
I would argue, certainly, let me just back up in time, 70s and 80s, there was a lot of discussion about should other countries copy the United States? Should they also have their own Section 301? And even in the 70s and 80s, there was not that much enthusiasm for doing that. And in fact, we had the opposite, which is everyone said this is bad. Allowing the United States to act unilaterally is bad. We should collectively come together and restrain both the United States in its unilateral actions, but also we should restrain the activities of everyone else. And if we manage to sort of tie our hands together in ways that was meaningful, then we would all end up in a better position. And they actually came together rather than fragmented apart in again in the 90s with the reform of the GATT system and the movement to the World Trade Organization. Something similar could happen now. It's not out of the realm of possibility that we will have more cooperative action. And in fact, I would argue, interestingly, over the last year since Liberation Day in the US, we have seen an awful lot more countries outside of the US moving to collaborate, to cooperate, to sign agreements. Even India, which has been allergic to signing trade deals with everybody because they said, no, the system is working. We all should work in the system. Don't deviate from that, is on a stampede right now to sign as many trade deals as they possibly can. And so that I think we could have the same outcome, which is the United States is unilateral. Everyone else is trying to sort of collaborate in some way. We see all kinds of new initiatives being signed, being spoken about, whether that's the expansion of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, the expansion of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We have accessions in both of those. Some kind of potential discussion between them. I don't think that's going to go very far, but nonetheless, there's a discussion. I think that's interesting. Discussion between the European Union and the CPTPP countries. So that's getting to be an interesting critical mass of countries thinking about how do we keep trade open. Even the little smaller countries, Singapore, New Zealand, UAE, Switzerland, and I think now we're up to almost 20 other countries, are trying to figure out in the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, FITP, how can they create some kind of integration? They're all trade dependent. If trade all becomes protectionist, it's a disaster for them. So how can we make sure that our markets stay open to one another? So I think the US could, again, ironically, actually get everybody else to cooperate and leave the United States behind, Fortress US. That would be problematic for the US. It might be problematic for others. It's still a major market for a lot of sales of goods and services. But I think that could happen. Alternatively, others could look for levers. How can they operate in their own space? We do see some of that already. But the challenge for most places is that they don't have the same kind of chokehold things that they can actually get a lever, especially vis-a-vis the United States or China or the European Union or something. Like against a big player, it's very hard to do. But you've seen, I think, Iran successfully grab a chokehold of their own and actually show that they can make other countries pay attention in ways that is, again, sort of problematic. So we could come together. We could fragment further. I think eventually what will happen, and I'm not sure I will be here to see it, but eventually we will all say, this is stupid. This has just raised prices for everybody. It's increased complexity. Our compliance costs are through the roof. We must simplify things. We must come back together as some kind of collective, and we must try to figure out how can we make the rules consistent. We will end up back where we potentially started, but it's going to be a while between here and there.
Well, that leads into Julia Bali's question, or Boli, forgive me if I mispronounced it. The increasing use of 301 in the 80s and 90s was one of the key drivers of GATT reform and the establishment of the WTO, she says. Do you think there's any possibility that this new wave of US trade unilateralism could result in WTO reform?
I think it's possible. I think that there are many challenges that the WTO has, but one big challenge, of course, is the consensus principle, right? Which says nothing happens until we all agree not to block activity. So we don't have to veto it exactly, but we have to agree to let it happen. So once you have, and I did a video for us early on at the Hinrich Foundation that said, if you have 166 members and all 166 members have to have consensus in order to order lunch, we all have to agree on the same menu. We all have to agree on the same restaurant. I don't think we're eating. I think we're starving before we actually manage to get 166 countries to agree on what to eat. That's the challenge we have at the WTO. So yes, US unilateralism could create pressures for reform at the WTO, but it would require the United States not to veto or not to block consensus on whatever that is. I'm not sure that I see that now, but again, I can imagine it going forward a couple of years. Maybe there is a different administration in place, for example, and they are much more relaxed about cooperation, and they would argue we are all better off if we cooperate. We will release our hold on consensus. And potentially other countries that have continuously taken hostages at the WTO would say, this is actually not working for us either. We also need to stop taking hostages. And therefore, we actually get reform, like meaningful reform at the WTO. So okay, it could certainly happen. And if we've learned anything in the last, whatever it's been now, 18 months, it's that lots of things that you would have said never in a million years would take place actually are taking place. So yeah, we could get, amazingly, we could come out of this in short order with a reformed world system that actually is more fit for purpose for whatever the 2027 and beyond.
We have a question from a Mexican journalist, Stephanie, who says, how should journalists distinguish between legitimate trade enforcement and protectionism when they're writing about Section 301 cases?
Wow, this is a challenging one, isn't it? A part of the challenge here is that a lot of these are sort of in the eye of the beholder. So you're going to have to say, viewed from whose perspective is this a legitimate action, and viewed from whose perspective is it not a legitimate action? So that's the first thing. And then you need to say, again, sort of based on what? Is there a particular rule that's being violated? Is there a particular law that's being violated? Is there something crucially that is discriminatory about this action? So we allow everybody else to do this, but not you. Like that would be a problem. That looks more like protectionism than legitimate public policy answers. I think it is hard sometimes. Sometimes it is very hard to identify this is clearly protectionist and this is legitimate. Sometimes it's glaringly obvious, So there are some really good examples that I recall from the 80s. I'm going to pick on the Japanese, and I'm sure they're going to complain later, but I will pick on them anyways. Two that I particularly liked in the 1980s, the Japanese had rules about skis, and they argued that they couldn't let the American skis in because Japanese snow was different. And therefore, American skis were a legitimate health and safety threat. And the Americans, of course, said this is ridiculous. Snow is snow. And, this is just about straight up protectionism. We had that kind of thing happening. And I would say a journalist could probably safely call that one way or the other without being, too without anybody really complaining too much. But there are some cases that are tough, and particularly where they get tough is health and safety, legitimate health and safety, where you say, I'm not certain that, for example, this level of pesticide is appropriate. And now you're supposed to use scientific basis for those kinds of decisions, but sometimes the scientific basis is also unclear. So you have to make a call, a judgment call, whether you think like this level of pesticide or that level of pesticide is appropriate. You may lean one way or the other. To one country, it looks like protectionism. To another, it looks like I shouldn't allow my citizens to be eating pesticide laced food. So I think there's a bunch of cases like this that are much more hard to call clearly. And I think it's fair for journalists to say it's the jury is out, basically. I can't really say one way or the other. But in some cases, it is glaringly obvious. And I would love to have journalists be less even handed and simply say, this is protectionism. This is clearly done for the purpose of discriminating against this market or of keeping out foreign products or whatever. This is protectionism.
Um, we have a question that says, if Congress is unlikely to restrain the Trump administration's tariff policy, do you think that American voters, households may be paying an estimated average 1,000 more annually due to higher tariffs, may at some point push back via the midterms or in some other way?
Well, we see that Trump's tariff policy in particular is historically unpopular. In public opinion poll after public opinion poll shows quite clearly that Americans across the spectrum are not happy with the economic policies of the United States, and they're not happy specifically about tariff policy. In way, and in fact, not only, which I find not a surprise, but what I do think is interesting is that Americans are actually more pro-trade now than they've ever been. Trade is never polled well. But for whatever reason, it always gets blamed for every kind of ill that takes place. It's always trade's fault. Coming through COVID in particular, I think people suddenly said, actually, trade is kind of beneficial for us. Like we wouldn't have made it through COVID if we hadn't had trade in lots of things, not the least of which, of course, vaccines and personal protective gear and all of those sorts of things, but also food, which continued to move, toilet paper, which actually got through. People said, trade actually matters to me. It matters to me in my day, and I therefore need trade. So I think the interesting thing to me is that people are more in favor of trade, more hostile to tariff. They know what a tariff is, which I find astonishing. Like for years, nobody knew what they were. And now suddenly, taxi drivers are talking to you about tariffs. So I think the popular opinion is clear. Tariffs are a no. Trade policy is a problem, needs to be adjusted, even among supporters of Trump. And so will this affect the midterms? Possibly. I mean, voters do vote on their personal economic situation. This will be on the list. But if I gave you a list of things that you were upset about, my guess is that even though you generally like trade more and you don't like tariffs, that's probably not where you're going to like pull the lever to vote for this party or that party. But it will be a combination of things. And it is interesting to me that the public opinion polling is so striking against tariffs and this trade policy. And yet the president still insists tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language, and that if you only hang in there with him to the bitter end, you will see what amazing things come at the other end of it. And so, you just need to keep waiting it out a little bit longer, and then things will get really great. And I'm not sure that the American public has that kind of fortitude to hang in there till the bitter end with him.
Yes, I think gas prices are going to be a major issue in the midterms, which is more Iran war related.
Iran war rather than tariffs. But again, you're manipulating trade. And I think people would say coming out of this, actually trade does matter to me. And it matters to me in ways that I might not have appreciated, like just being able to access fuel for my vehicle, jet fuel to fly, plastics of all kinds, because plastic chemicals production is really disrupted, fertilizer. Next year, we're all going to have some food challenges because of fertilizer disruptions. I think we are showing on a daily basis trade matters to you, even if you think of yourself as not being part of the economy that's engaged in trade.
But what I would caution as far as a flip in control in even if in both chambers is there is still a tendency towards protectionism in Congress, even after all this, because of the way that trade benefits everyone at a sort of smaller level and hurts certain players at a stronger level. An example I'm going to give on that is there was just a letter, bipartisan letter, both chambers, from more than 100 members of Congress asking for a 301 investigation into sugar. Sugar is one of the most protected sectors in the United States already. And they were saying, no, these other countries are unfairly damaging our sugar industry. We've had all these sugar refineries close. You're going to destroy the sugar industry. And sugar beets are grown in the upper Midwest, and sugar cane is grown in the South. So it was across various regions. So even as you hear
Wow.
a lot of Democrats saying these tariffs are stupid, when they have a particular constituent who wants tariff protection, they're inclined to say, okay, I agree.
Which is why we've got actually, I think it's interesting. That's why we have Congress delegating so much trade authority to the president, because Congress says or said, we know that if you let us, 535 of us, drive trade policy, we will drive us into a protectionist dead end because all of us have incentives to listen to the loudest voices. The loudest voices are those like the sugar beet farmers who say it's totally unfair that other people make sugar. So they will, by themselves, end up protectionists. We shouldn't allow that to happen. We will create an executive agency and give a lot of power over to the executive to be able to manage trade on our behalf. We will give them instructions, which is what's supposed to happen. We'll give them instructions. We'll tell them what we want, what we don't want. We'll give them the sort of big picture. They go do stuff. They come back and they ask us if we're okay. And we'll say yes or no. But the reason why that Congress did that is they recognize their own incentives to be protectionist. And I think sugar is the most classic example of all time. I mean, Americans pay, I think, 6 times the world price for sugar. I mean, if you had to make a stupid policy, this has got to be it. And I'm really going to get more complaints from people, but I'm going to do it anyways. So 6 times the world price. So what happens? The United States then shifts to alternative kinds of sugar, like corn syrup. Corn syrup turns out to be amazingly fattening. People end up enormously obese. We have all sorts of problems, health problems, sugar problems, changing. Oh, yeah. Could there be a more backwards policy? And then to argue that somehow other people are unfair, hypocrisy knows no bounds.
But at least we have trade in GLP inhibitors now to help us with this. All right, well, we're coming to the end. Dr. Wells, would you like to give us some closing thoughts on what to be watching for as journalists as the 301 recommendations, and then another round of comments, and then what will happen this summer or maybe early this fall with tariffs and
We are going to have tariffs in our future, right? So the question is how fast and how far and how high. So even if Greer says that he's going to allow an opportunity for comments, I'm personally skeptical that that will be very meaningful. I suspect that I could announce on Friday that I'm opening for comments, and you have 3 days in which to get your comments in, and then I decide the following Friday. Everything happens on a Friday. So I would expect journalists, your Friday and or weekend is wrecked because we will continue to have policy changes in the trade and tariff space on Friday/Saturday, my Saturday, your Friday. That will continue because they're just, again, Trump loves a good tariff. We have lots of good reasons the US administration thinks that they have for imposing tariffs of various kinds against the planet. Different countries differently, but overall against the planet. And I think that that will continue. So we will see more tariffs. We will see more trade disruption driven by the US. We will see more what we used to call US trade partners, but I now call countries that trade with the United States. Countries that trade with the United States will be looking for alternatives at a speed and a rate that I would have found unthinkable a very short time ago, but I now see this stampede to look for others, even in highly dependent markets, looking for new ways to lower that risk, ways to increase certainty. And I think we will see, so Section 301 for sure, other kinds of export policies, other kinds of security, the sort of mingling of security and trade, which has gotten to be very difficult, especially out of the US, but increasingly outside of the US. There are no end, in my mind, of stories that are coming on the trade and economic front. And so that makes it, I would argue, on an optimistic note, a great time to be a journalist because there is tremendous interest in all things trade related, which was not true that long ago, where people just sort of were like, trade, yeah, that's that yawn, it's not interesting. Suddenly, trade is super interesting to an awful lot of people. And so, as reporters and journalists, there are a lot of stories to cover. They are not just about the US and China and potentially Europe. They are also about how does everyone else manage this kind of trade disruption. They are big companies and small companies. How are citizens handling this? I think the range of stories that you could produce on trade and economics is really never been higher. And the interest in those stories has never been higher. So it's a great time. I said, but it's a terrible time to be a citizen in many ways, but great time to be a journalist.
We like to joke that President Trump has a guaranteed employment for trade journalists as one of his
Yeah.
policies.
In his first administration, I made hats and it said making trade great again. And the argument for that was that all of a sudden everyone wanted to talk trade. So, yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you for all of you that have watched this incredibly wonky webinar. I hope you got something useful. This has been an educational program from the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, an independent, Asia-based philanthropic organization dedicated to advancing beneficial and sustainable global trade. AFPC USA is solely responsible for the content of this episode. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.